For 33 years, nothing about Jun Suk's life had been uncertain. Every morning, the same routine. The same elevator ride down from the penthouse in Haeundae, the same nod from his man, the same quiet respect that followed him into every room. At 38, Jun Suk ruled sections of Busan that most men only whispered about. Shipping routes. Night markets. Construction contracts that never went to open bidding. His name never appeared in headlines, but when prosecutors transferred districts, it was always because of him. Yet inside his home, there was only one rule he never enforced. Grace Thompson came and went as she pleased. She was 78. Black. Soft-spoken. And she had been in his life longer than power, longer than blood, longer than memory itself. Grace arrived in Korea before Jun Suk learned how to read. She cooked his meals, folded his clothes, sat beside his bed during the long winters when his father didn't come home. When his mother collapsed during a Buddhist memorial ceremony in Seoul, it was Grace who carried him out while men in black suits argued about inheritance. She never called herself his nanny. She called him son only when she thought he was asleep. For decades, Grace returned home every night at exactly 9:40 p.m. rain or snow. Holiday or riot. She removed her shoes, hummed softly, and brewed tea that filled the apartment with a quiet warmth Jun Suk never spoke about. Until one night, she didn't come home on time. The first night she was late, Jun Suk noticed because the house felt empty in a way that numbers and money could not fix. 9:40 passed. 9:50, 10:10. The kitchen light was off. Grace never turned it off. When she finally arrived close to 11, her coat smelled faintly of cold incense. Her hands were steady, but her eyes avoided his. "You're late," he said calmly. "Yes," she replied. Nothing more. No apology. No explanation. Jun Suk stood in the doorway of his study, watching her move through the hall. Her steps were slower than usual. Deliberate. She hung her coat without the usual pause, without the soft hum that always came before tea. She disappeared into her room. The door closed quietly. Jun Suk remained standing. Outside, the city pulsed with movement. Cars honked along Marine City. Voices carried up from the street below. Inside, the silence pressed against him like a wet cloth. He returned to his desk. Opened a file. Read the same line 3 times without absorbing it. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Grace's light stayed off. This had never happened before. And he knew it wouldn't be the last time. The second night, Grace came home at 10:30. Jun Suk was standing by the window when he heard her shoes against the floor. She moved through the apartment without turning on the main lights. Only the small lamp near the entryway flickered to life. He didn't go to her. She didn't come to him. By the 4th night, the pattern had solidified. Grace left at her usual time in the morning. She prepared his meals. She folded his shirts with the same precise care she had always shown. But when evening came, she disappeared into routines that no longer included him. She began wearing darker clothes. Black skirt. Charcoal cardigan. Colors that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Her prayers grew longer. Jun Suk noticed because the apartment had always carried the faint sound of her voice in the early morning. Soft murmurs in English, occasionally slipping into Korean. Now, the prayers stretched past dawn. He could hear them through the walls. And she locked her bedroom door. Grace had never locked her door. Not during typhoons. Not during the riots in 2014 when smoke drifted through the streets, and men with iron bars tested the boundaries of power. Not even when Jun Suk's enemies tried to reach him through the people closest to him. But now, every night, he heard the click of the lock. Jun Suk's empire functioned perfectly. Shipments arrived on time. Payments cleared without issue. A rival syndicate in Gwangju folded after a quiet meeting that lasted 11 minutes. His men respected him. His enemies feared him. But inside his home, control had slipped through his fingers like water. He told himself it didn't matter. Grace was old. Perhaps she was tired. Perhaps she needed space he had never thought to offer. But the house felt wrong. The tea was still brewing. The meals were still warm. Yet the rhythm that had held his life together for 3 decades had fractured in a way he couldn't name. Jun Suk sat alone in his study, staring at reports he no longer cared about. Grace was the last living connection to warmth he had. His mother was gone. His father was ash. The women who moved through his life were careful, transactional, forgettable. Grace had raised him when no one else would. And now she was disappearing. Not physically. But in every way that mattered. On the 3rd night, she didn't come home until midnight. Jun Suk ordered the surveillance on the 5th night. He didn't use his usual men. He chose 2 who had worked in intelligence before the underworld claimed them. Quiet. Invisible. The kind who could follow a shadow without casting one. Don't approach her, he said. Don't interfere. Just watch. The younger one hesitated. Boss, she's. I know who she is. They left without another word. The reports came back in fragments. Grace left the apartment at 7:15 p.m. She walked. Refused the driver Jun Suk had sent. Refused the car idling at the corner with tinted windows and a man who would have died before letting her walk alone. She moved through streets that once belonged to rival gangs. Through alleys where bodies had been found with no names attached. Through neighborhoods where even police traveled in pairs. Grace walked alone. And no one touched her. The men following her felt something they rarely admitted. Discomfort. Not from danger. From wrongness. It feels like we're watching something we shouldn't, the older one said into the phone. Jun Suk didn't respond. On the 7th night, the pattern became clear. Grace entered the same place without deviation. Same route. At the same time. Same destination. A building in Donggu, near the industrial docks. No sign outside. No indication of what it was. Just a low concrete structure with narrow windows and a single light above the entrance. The men watched her bow before entering. Watched her remove her shoes. Watched her disappear inside. An hour later, she emerged. Her face was calm. Her hands were folded. She walked home the same way she had come. The older man ran the address. His voice was tight when he called back. Boss. It's a funeral hall. Jun Suk set the phone down slowly. Grace had no family in Korea. No friends from her years here who had passed recently. No reason to visit a funeral hall alone, night after night, in a part of the city she had never mentioned. He stared at the address written on the paper in front of him. And he decided to see for himself. Jun Suk arrived after dark. The funeral hall was small. Unremarkable. The kind of place where people mourned quietly because they had no choice. No crowds. No ceremony. Just grief pressed into corners where no one would notice. He parked a block away and walked. Inside, the air was thick with incense. Sandalwood and chrysanthemum. The scent clung to his clothes immediately. Traditional Korean funeral customs shaped the space. White fabric draped across the walls. Offering tables lined with fruit, rice cakes, and small cups of soju. Photographs arranged in neat rows, each framed in black lacquer. Grace was kneeling in front of one. Her back was to him. Her head bowed low. Her hands pressed together in prayer. Jun Suk stayed in the shadows near the entrance. He watched her lips move without sound. Watched her shoulders rise and fall with breath that seemed heavier than it should be. She stayed for 20 minutes. Then she stood. Bowed 3 times. and left without looking back. Jun Suk waited until her footsteps faded before moving forward. The photograph she had been kneeling before was small. Simple wooden frame. Black ribbon tied at the corner. The face staring back at him was young. 25. Maybe younger. Sharp eyes. High cheekbones. A thin scar beneath his chin that cut across the jawline like a signature. Jun Suk had seen that face before. Not in person. In a report. 2 years ago. Status, eliminated. Cause of death, construction accident. The report had crossed his desk during a routine audit of territorial disputes. A minor incident. A body was found near a development site in Seogu. No witnesses. No loose ends. The report bore his seal. His approval. The name beneath the photograph tightened something in his chest. Kang Min-jae. The name his father never allowed to be spoken. The name Grace was once whispered in prayer when she thought no one was listening. Jun Suk stood frozen. The incense burned. The candles flickered. The face in the photograph stared at him with eyes that felt too familiar. He had seen this man die before. Min-jae was his half-brother. Jun Suk learned this not from Grace, but from a file he should never have had access to. It took 2 days of digging. Bribes to clerks who managed birth records. Threats to men who handled estate documents. Pressure was applied to people who had spent decades keeping secrets for money. The truth came in pieces. Min-jae was born to a woman his father paid to disappear. A mistress kept in Ulsan. Hidden. Erased from every official record. The woman died when Min-jae was 12. No family claimed him. No inheritance reached him. He grew up outside the system. Without protection. Without power. Without the name that would have saved him. Min-jae entered the underworld not knowing who ruled it. Not knowing the bloodline that connected him to the man who would eventually order his death. The construction accident was no accident. Jun Suk found the original request buried in old communications. A territorial dispute. A crew is causing problems near a development site controlled by his network. Orders given to eliminate the problem. Efficiently. Quietly. Min-jae had been part of that crew. And Jun Suk had signed off on his execution without knowing his name. Grace had known. The realization hit him like a fist to the chest. She had known before he did. She had known when Min-jae was still alive. She had known and said nothing. Jun Suk confronted her on the 9th night. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. Grace was in the kitchen, washing teacups by hand. The water ran softly. Her movements were steady. "You knew," he said. Grace didn't turn around. "I suspected." "You prayed with him." "Yes." "You hid him." Her hands stilled in the water. "I tried to." Jun Suk stepped closer. His reflection appeared in the window above the sink. He looked older than 38. Older than he had ever felt. "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace dried her hands slowly. Folded the towel. Set it on the counter. "Because you would have done what you always do," she said quietly. "You would have tried to fix it. And some things cannot be fixed by power. He was my blood. He was a boy the world forgot," Grace said. "You were the world that forgot him." Jun Suk felt something crack inside his chest. That night, he shattered a glass with his bare hand and didn't notice the blood until Grace wrapped his fingers in gauze without asking permission. She looked at him with eyes that carried 33 years of silence. "I hid him," Grace said. "From you." The old man's name was Park. He ran a small repair shop near Jigalki Market. Fixed radios. Sold used electronics. The kind of man who had lived long enough to see power change hands 3 times without ever choosing a side. Jun Suk found him by accident. One of his men mentioned seeing Grace at the market, talking to an old Korean man who seemed to recognize her. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. But the man had bowed to her. Deeply. The kind of bow reserved for someone who had saved your life. Jun Suk went to the shop alone. Park was behind the counter, soldering a circuit board. His hands were steady despite his age. When Jun Suk entered, the old man looked up once and knew exactly who he was. "You're Grace's boy," Park said. Not a question. Jun Suk closed the door behind him. "You know her." Park set down his tools. Wiped his hands on a rag stained with oil and time. "Years ago," Park said, "she begged someone powerful to spare a boy." Jun Suk felt his pulse slow. What boy? A boy who stole from the wrong people. A boy marked for death before he even understood what death meant. Park's eyes stayed on him. "That boy was you." Jun Suk didn't move. "You were 14, Park continued. Angry. Reckless. You took money from a syndicate courier because you thought your father's name would protect you. It didn't. They wanted to make an example. Wanted to show that bloodline meant nothing without respect." Jun Suk remembered that year. The year his father stopped coming home. The year men in black suits visited the apartment and spoke in voices too low for him to hear. The year Grace stopped smiling. "She went to them," Park said. "Alone. No leverage. No threat. Just an old black woman who cleaned houses and raised other people's children. She asked them to wait. To give you time to learn. To become the man you were supposed to be. And they listened." Park smiled faintly. "They listened because she promised them something no one else could. She promised that if they spared you, you would become more valuable alive than dead. And she was right." Jun Suk stood in a small shop, surrounded by broken radios and the smell of burnt solder. Grace had intervened before blood hardened him. Before violence became reflexive. Before he learned that killing was easier than mercy. And now, history was repeating itself. If she was doing it again, who was she saving this time? Grace stopped going to the funeral hall after the 10th night. Jun Suk's men confirmed it. But she didn't come home earlier. Instead, she began visiting a different place. A location that didn't appear on any of Jun Suk's maps. A building tucked between a shuttered textile factory and a warehouse that hadn't been used in years. No sign outside. No indication of what it was. The lights inside were always low. Jun Suk sent men to observe. They reported back with confusion. "It's a community center," the younger one said. "But not official. No registration. No permits. Who goes there? Immigrants. Dock workers. Women without papers. Men with old scars and no affiliations. People in Jun Suk's world were ignored. People who existed in the cracks between power and law. People who moved through the city like ghosts because visibility meant deportation, arrest, or worse. Grace spoke to them softly. She brought food in containers wrapped in cloth. She sat with women who cried in languages Jun Suk's men didn't recognize. She listened to men who spoke in broken Korean about wages stolen and injuries ignored. And she was organizing something. The men couldn't say what. Only that Grace was careful. Deliberate. She wrote nothing down. She made no calls. She simply moved through the space like someone planting seeds in soil only she could see. Jun Suk realized this could threaten his empire. Not directly. Not with violence. But with exposure. People like Grace didn't organize for power. They organized for justice. And justice always required someone to blame. Someone to hold accountable. Someone to sacrifice. Stopping her would be simple. One word. One order. One quiet elimination of a problem before it became a crisis. But stopping her might destroy what was left of him. Jun Suk stood in his penthouse, staring at the city below. Lights stretched endlessly. Ships moved through the harbor like pieces on a board that only he could see. He had built this. Controlled this. And now an old woman was dismantling it without ever raising her voice. Grace was preparing something that did not include him. Jun Suk found the envelope in Grace's room. He hadn't meant to enter. The door was unlocked. A rare mistake. Or perhaps not a mistake at all. The room was neat. Bed made with hospital corners. A single photograph on the nightstand showed a younger Grace standing beside a church in a place Jun Suk didn't recognize. Her Bible sat open to a page marked with a pressed flower. The envelope was on the dresser. Plain. White. No name written across the front. Inside was a plain ticket. One way. Departure, Gimhae International Airport. Destination, Kotoka International Airport, Accra. The date was circled in red ink. 2 weeks away. Jun Suk stood holding the ticket. Grace had been in Korea for 50 years. She had no family left in Ghana. No home to return to. No reason to leave except the one she refused to speak aloud. She was not running. She was leaving. Permanently. Jun Suk placed the ticket back exactly as he found it. Smoothed the envelope. Left the room as quietly as he had entered. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his study, staring at the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. Ships moved through the harbor. Cars traced patterns along the expressway. The world continued as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Grace had built a life around him for 33 years. She had raised him. Protected him. Stood between him and a violence that would have consumed him before he learned how to wield it. And now she was preparing to disappear. Not because she was tired. Not because she was done. Because staying meant watching what he would become. Or because leaving meant protecting something he didn't yet understand. Jun Suk didn't confront her about the ticket. Didn't ask where she was going or why. Silence had become the only language they shared. But silence was no longer neutral. It had weight. It had consequences. And it was suffocating him. She was not planning to come back. The final night came without warning. Grace prepared dinner as she always had. Mayak guk. Banchan is arranged in small ceramic dishes. Rice steamed until each grain separated perfectly. Jun Suk sat across from her at the table. They ate in silence. The clock on the wall marked time, neither of them acknowledged. Outside, rain began to fall. Soft at first. Then heavier. The kind of rain that erased sound and made the world feel smaller. When Grace stood to clear the dishes, Jun Suk spoke. I know about the ticket. Her hands paused. Then continued. She carried the dishes to the sink without turning around. I expected you would. You're leaving. Yes. Jun Suk stood. Walked to the window. Watched rain streak down the glass like cracks spreading through ice. For how long? Grace dried her hands on a towel. Folded it carefully. Set it on the counter. I don't expect to return. The words settled between them as stones dropped into still water. Jun Suk felt something dangerous rise in his chest. Something he had spent his entire life suppressing. Controlling. Denying. I never married, he said quietly. Grace turned to face him. I never trusted anyone else, he continued. Never let anyone close. Never allowed myself to need what I couldn't control. His voice was steady. But his hands weren't. You raised me, he said. You chose me when no one else would. You stood between me and every threat that tried to reach me. You saved my life before I knew it needed saving. Grace's expression softened. You were never meant to belong to anyone, she said. Only to yourself. Jun Suk stepped closer. You don't understand. I understand more than you think. He stood 2 feet away from her. Close enough to see the lines around her eyes. Close enough to see the weight she carried that had nothing to do with age. You raised me, he said again. But that's not. He stopped. The words wouldn't form. 38 years of control. Of calculated distance. Of refusing to admit weakness or need or the kind of vulnerability that got men killed. And he couldn't say it. Grace looked at him with a tenderness that frightened him more than any enemy ever had. I knew, she said softly. Jun Suk's breath caught. When you built this place for me. When you killed men who disrespected me. When you stood between me and danger without ever touching me. She paused. I've always known how you feel. The rain fell harder. But love that asks for nothing, Grace said, is the most dangerous kind. Jun Suk wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her she was wrong. That's what he felt wasn't dangerous. That it was the only thing keeping him human. But she wasn't wrong. And they both knew it. Grace picked up her coat from the chair. Put it on slowly. Buttoned it with hands that had buttoned his shirts when he was too young to do it himself. The most dangerous love, she said, is the one that asks for nothing. The airport was crowded. Jun Suk stood near the international departures gate, watching people say goodbye. Families embracing. Children crying. Lovers holding each other like separation was death. Grace arrived alone. She wore the same dark coat. The same worn shoes. She carried a single suitcase that looked older than the years they had shared. She saw him immediately. Didn't seem surprised. They stood facing each other in the middle of the terminal. People moved around them like water around stones. You came, she said. I had to. Grace smiled faintly. To stop me? Or to say goodbye? Jun Suk didn't answer. Because he didn't know. I won't ask you to stay, he said finally. I know. And I won't follow you. I know that too. Grace reached out. Touched his hand. Her fingers were warm despite the cold outside. You are not your father, she said quietly. Jun Suk looked down at her hand on his. You keep saying that. Because you keep forgetting. She squeezed his hand once. Then let go. Turned toward the gate. Jun Suk watched her walk away. Watched her disappear into the crowd of travelers moving toward security. Watched her become just another old woman with a suitcase and a destination no one would question. He didn't stop her. But that night, before her plane even reached cruising altitude, Jun Suk made 3 calls. The first secured protection on every route she had ever taken in Accra. Men who would never let her know they were watching. Who would die before letting harm reach her. The second opened accounts she would never trace back to him. Money that would appear when she needed it. Resources that would feel like a coincidence. The third call went to someone he hadn't spoken to in years. A journalist. Someone who investigated corruption. Who exposed systems that crushed people without names. Who asked questions that made powerful men uncomfortable. Because Grace had taken something with her. Not in her suitcase. Not on paper. But in her memory. Evidence of bodies buried under construction sites. Of workers paid in promises and threats. Many immigrants disappeared when they asked for wages. Of systems designed to erase people Grace had spent months trying to save. Evidence that could dismantle his empire. Or redeem it. Jun Suk didn't know which she would choose. 3 weeks later, a message reached him from an unknown number. You are not your father. Decide carefully. Jun Suk stood in his penthouse, staring at the city below. Ships moved through the harbor. Light stretched endlessly. Power hummed beneath every surface. He had built this. Controlled this. And now grace had given him a choice he couldn't delegate. To protect what he had built by destroying what she had started. Or to become someone his father never was. Power had never scared him before. Love did.